Rebirth in Havenwood. The Sins of the Father, A Tale of Two Lives. Chapter 1, Return to Dust. The dust swirled around Elias's worn pickup as he pulled onto the dirt road leading into Havenwood. The town was aptly named. A tiny pocket of green nestled amidst rolling hills, a place where secrets could be buried as easily as seeds. He'd chosen it for its obscurity, its distance, and its anonymity. At 43, Elias Thorne's face was a weathered map of suffering, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much, a perpetual tension in his jaw that 15 years behind bars had carved into permanence. His once dark hair was now threaded with silver, particularly at the temples. Prison had aged him, transformed him from the vibrant architect with a promising future into this hollow-eyed spectre seeking refuge. As he navigated the winding road, his knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. Freedom still felt foreign, almost painful in its vastness. For 15 years, his world had been confined to an 8by10 cell in Oak Creek Penitentiary, his days marked by the rhythmic clanging of metal doors and the endless drone of fluorescent lights. Now, the open sky above him seemed oppressive in its boundlessness. Havenwood appeared on the horizon, a cluster of modest buildings surrounded by towering pines. It wasn't much: a general store, a small library, a diner with a flickering neon sign, and scattered houses with peeling paint and sagging porches. But to Elias, it represented possibility, a blank canvas upon which to paint a new life, far from the shadow of his father. Richard Thorne. The name still tasted bitter on his tongue. Richard Thorne, the pillar of Oak Creek society, a successful lawyer, a generous philanthropist, a charismatic leader. Richard Thorne, the man who had meticulously framed his own son for murder. Richard Thorne, the monster who had stolen 15 years of Elias's life. Elias pulled up to a ramshackle cabin at the edge of town, the place he'd purchased sight unseen with the meager compensation the state had offered for his wrongful conviction. It wasn't much, a single-story structure with a sagging roof and windows clouded with grime, but it was his. A place to begin again, to rebuild from ashes. As he stepped out of the truck, the weight of his past settled heavily on his shoulders. He was free, but freedom came with its own kind of prison, the prison of memory, of trauma, of a life irrevocably altered. "Welcome to Havenwood," he murmured to himself, the words carried away by the wind that rustled through the surrounding pines, a sound so different from the constant cacophony of prison. Welcome home. Chapter 2, Seeds of Doubt. 20 years earlier. The Thorne family home stood as a testament to success, a sprawling colonial with manicured lawns and gleaming windows that reflected the sunlight in Oak Creek's most prestigious neighborhood. Inside, 23-year-old Elias sat across from his father in the immaculately appointed study, surrounded by leather-bound law books and framed accolades. "Architecture is a fine pursuit," Richard said, swirling amber liquid in a crystal tumbler, "but law has stability, son. Prestige. Security." Elias shifted uncomfortably under his father's penetrating gaze. Richard Thorne had always been imposing, tall, with a full head of dark hair despite his 50 years, and eyes that seemed to dissect rather than observe. He radiated authority, charm, and a subtle coldness that Elias had spent a lifetime trying to decipher. "I've already accepted the position at Hartman and Associates," Elias replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "The Richardson project is a chance to make a name for myself." Richard's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Always so determined to forge your own path. I learned from you, Dad. You always said a man should stand on his own merits." A flicker of something, pride, amusement, contempt, passed across Richard's face before it settled back into its usual measured expression. "Indeed. Well, I suppose you must follow your passion." He pronounced the word as if it was slightly distasteful. Later that evening, as Elias was leaving, he passed his father's study and paused at the sound of Richard's voice, low and intent. Peering through the barely open door, he saw his father hunched over his desk, spreading out newspaper clippings with gloved hands. "Third one found near the ravine," Richard was muttering to himself. "Police still have no leads." A soft chuckle escaped him, chilling in its satisfaction. Elias withdrew silently, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was nothing, he told himself. His father was working on a case, that's all. But the image of Richard's face, alight with a cold satisfaction that bordered on pleasure, lingered in his mind, planting the first seeds of a terrible suspicion. Over the following months, Elias began to notice patterns. His father's unexplained absences coinciding with local disappearances. The unsettling calmness Richard exhibited when discussing unsolved cases. The locked room in the basement that Richard claimed was merely for file storage but guarded with unusual vigilance. Elias started keeping a record, dates, times, observations. Nothing conclusive, just a growing constellation of unsettling coincidences. He told himself it was paranoia, that he was letting his imagination run wild. After all, this was his father, the man who had taught him to ride a bike, who had proudly attended his college graduation, who was respected throughout Oak Creek for his legal brilliance and community service. But the unease persisted, festering like an infected wound. Then came the day when, helping his mother clear out some old boxes from the attic, Elias discovered a small wooden chest hidden beneath floorboards. Inside lay newspaper clippings dating back decades, each detailing an unsolved murder or disappearance. Alongside them were small trinkets, a woman's earring, a child's hair ribbon, a man's class ring, trophies kept by someone who derived pleasure from collecting pieces of the dead. Elias stared at the items, while rising in his throat, the horrible truth he'd been avoiding crystallizing into certainty. His father, the man he'd admired all his life, was a killer. A predator who had been hiding in plain sight, using his position and influence to hunt without consequence. That night, Elias began transferring his observations to a digital format, creating an encrypted dossier on his laptop. He was still deliberating what to do with this information: go to the police, confront his father, when the first body was discovered. Chapter 3, The Frame. Angela Marshall, city councilwoman and vocal critic of several development projects Richard had championed, was found strangled in her home, her body posed with meticulous care. 2 weeks later, District Judge Samuel Pearson was discovered in his chambers, his throat slit with surgical precision. The third victim, Dr. Elaine Winters, a prominent psychologist who had recently published a paper on recognizing sociopathic tendencies in high-functioning professionals, was found drowned in her own bathtub. Each murder bore the hallmarks of a calculating mind: no forced entry, minimal evidence, and a signature precision that spoke of careful planning. The town of Oak Creek, unaccustomed to such violence, descended into panic. The police, under intense pressure to make an arrest, began looking for connections between the victims. All three had opposed Richard Thorne in some professional capacity. The councilwoman had blocked his proposed development, the judge had ruled against him in a high-profile case, and the psychologist had evaluated him during a particularly contentious divorce case Richard had litigated, noting concerning behavior patterns in her report. But it wasn't Richard who fell under suspicion. It was Elias. The young architect had worked on designs for the development Angela Marshall had opposed. He had been seen arguing publicly with Judge Pearson over a permit issue. And he had briefly dated Dr. Winters' daughter in college, a relationship that had ended poorly. These tenuous connections might not have been enough on their own, but then more damning evidence emerged. A bloody shirt matching Elias's size was found near Dr. Winters' home. The murder weapon used on Judge Pearson was discovered in the trunk of Elias's car. Fibers from Angela Marshall's home appeared on Elias's jacket. Elias, shocked and confused, maintained his innocence. He tried to direct suspicion toward his father, sharing his dossier of observations with Detective Michael Reeves, the lead investigator on the case. But his claims were dismissed as desperate attempts to deflect blame. Your own father, Detective Reeves had said incredulously. Richard Thorne has been a pillar of this community for 30 years. You expect me to believe he's a serial killer because you found some newspaper clippings. And now you're trying to frame him to save yourself. What Elias didn't know was that Richard had already gotten to Reeves, leveraging old connections and subtle threats to ensure the detective saw only what Richard wanted him to see. The evidence against Elias mounted, each piece more damning than the last, all meticulously planted by Richard himself. The trial was a spectacle, with Richard playing the part of the devastated father perfectly. I cannot understand what happened to my son, he told reporters, his voice breaking with apparently genuine emotion. I raised him with values of integrity and respect for life. To think that he could commit such heinous acts. It haunts me. Richard even took the stand as a character witness, delivering a masterfully ambiguous testimony that appeared supportive on the surface but subtly undermined Elias's character. Elias has always been sensitive, troubled by perceived slights. I've worried about his stability since his teenage years. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. As the judge pronounced his sentence, life without the possibility of parole, Elias's eyes locked with his father's across the courtroom. In that moment, he saw it clearly: the cold satisfaction, the triumph, the utter absence of remorse. Richard Thorne had sacrificed his own son to protect his dark secret, and he felt nothing at all. Chapter 4, Iron and Shadow. Oak Creek Penitentiary rose from the surrounding farmland like a medieval fortress, concrete walls topped with coils of razor wire, guard towers at each corner, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness that seemed to seep from its very foundations. For Elias, the first year was a blur of terror and disbelief. The architect who had once designed spaces meant to inspire now occupied a concrete cell barely large enough to pace in. The transition from respected professional to convicted murderer, the worst kind of murderer, one who targeted the vulnerable and prominent alike, was jarring in its brutality. Prison was its own ecosystem with rigid hierarchies and unspoken rules. Elias, with his educated background and high-profile case, became an immediate target. The beatings came first, swift, brutal affairs that left him cowering in his cell, body throbbing with pain. Then came the isolation, the way other inmates withdrew from him as if his perceived monstrosity might be contagious. Victim Thorne, they called him in hushed whispers. Guards looked through him rather than at him. Letters he wrote proclaiming his innocence went unanswered. His mother visited once, her face grey with shock and grief, unable to reconcile the son she loved with the monster portrayed in court. I didn't do it, Mom, he pleaded across the visitation table. It was Dad. I've suspected for years. The things I've seen. Margaret Thorne had shaken her head, tears streaming down her pallid cheeks. Please, Elias. Don't do this. Don't make this even harder than it already is. She never came back. 6 months later, she took an entire bottle of sleeping pills with a glass of Richard's finest whiskey. The official ruling was suicide, but Elias knew better. His mother had discovered something. Perhaps she'd finally looked in that locked room in the basement, or found Richard's hidden trophies. Whatever she'd seen had been too terrible to live with. Richard never visited. He sent a brief note after Margaret's death. Your mother's heart couldn't bear what you've done. I hope you can live with that. The calculated cruelty of those words sent Elias into a rage so consuming that it took 3 guards to subdue him. That outburst earned him 3 months in solitary confinement. It was in that concrete box, with nothing but his own thoughts for company, that Elias hit rock bottom. The walls seemed to close in on him day by day, hour by hour, until breathing itself became an act of will. He contemplated ending it all, fashioning a noose from his bedsheets, or provoking the guards into a beating so severe it would finish him. On what he had decided would be his last day alive, the door to his cell opened to reveal not a guard but a man Elias had never seen before, tall, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that seemed out of place in the harshness of the prison. Mr. Thorne, the man said, my name is Samuel Hayes. I'm a volunteer with the Innocence Project. I'd like to talk to you about your case. Hayes was a retired criminal defense attorney who spent his days reviewing cases of possible wrongful conviction. Something about Elias's case had caught his attention: inconsistencies in the evidence, the speed of the jury's decision, the neat package of circumstantial connections that seemed almost too perfect. I'm not saying I believe you're innocent, Hayes had said during that first meeting. But there are questions here that deserve answers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pull Elias back from the brink. Hayes became a lifeline, visiting regularly, reviewing case files, teaching Elias the intricacies of the law that his father had manipulated so expertly against him. More importantly, Hayes treated Elias like a human being, the first person in over a year to do so. He listened without judgment, asked questions that prompted reflection rather than defensiveness, and offered small kindnesses that preserved Elias's dignity in a place designed to strip it away. The system failed you, Hayes told him one day, but that doesn't mean you have to let it destroy you. Use this time, Elias. Education programs, therapy, whatever's available. Build yourself up. Even if we never overturn this conviction, you need to find a way to live with purpose. Slowly, painfully, Elias began to follow that advice. He enrolled in the prison's limited educational offerings, eventually earning a paralegal certification. He joined a therapy group led by a compassionate counselor who specialized in trauma. He found unexpected solace in the prison library, losing himself in books that transported him beyond the walls. Years passed. Hayes's investigation moved at a glacial pace, hampered by missing evidence, reluctant witnesses, and the continuing influence of Richard Thorne, who had somehow elevated his standing in Oak Creek even further following the trial. Then Hayes suffered a massive stroke. At his funeral, which Elias was permitted to attend under heavy guard, a young woman approached him cautiously. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm Detective Sarah Chen. Sam was sharing his concerns about your case with me before he passed. I think he might have been onto something. Chen was new to the Oak Creek Police Department, unencumbered by the politics and allegiances that had facilitated Elias's frame-up. Fresh out of a stint with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, she had a keen eye for patterns and an almost pathological commitment to truth. I can't promise anything, she told him as the guards signaled that their time was up. But I'll look into it. Sam believed in you, and that means something to me. It wasn't much, just a flicker of hope in the darkness, but for Elias, it was enough to keep going. Chapter 5. The Mask Slips. While Elias endured the brutal monotony of prison life, Richard Thorne continued to thrive in Oak Creek. If anything, his son's conviction enhanced his standing in the community. He was now seen not only as a brilliant lawyer and community leader but also as a tragic figure, the upstanding father who had somehow raised a monster. Richard leveraged this sympathy masterfully, establishing a foundation in Margaret's name dedicated to supporting victims of violent crime. He gave moving speeches about the devastating impact of his son's actions, positioned himself as an advocate for criminal justice reform, and even published a memoir titled, Beyond Blood, When Family Fails, that became a national bestseller. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, Richard's true nature continued to assert itself. The need to kill, a compulsion he had managed with meticulous care for decades, grew stronger rather than diminishing with age. What had once been a carefully controlled urge that he indulged perhaps once a year had evolved into an almost monthly necessity. The first new victim appeared 3 years after Elias's conviction, a young paralegal in Richard's firm who had stumbled across old files related to Angela Marshall's opposition to his development project. Then came a retired detective who had made an offhand comment at a charity function about reopening some of Oak Creek's cold cases. A visiting journalist working on a retrospective about the Thorne case met a similar fate after asking too many questions about inconsistencies in the trial transcripts. Richard grew bolder with each successful kill, the thrill of escaping detection feeding a growing sense of invincibility. He began to leave subtle signatures, a particular way of positioning the bodies, a specific knot used in bindings, trophies taken with increasing carelessness. It was as if some part of him wanted recognition for his artistry, for the decades of perfect crimes. Detective Sarah Chen, meanwhile, had been quietly reinvestigating the original murders for which Elias had been convicted. She started with small inconsistencies, time of death estimates that didn't align with Elias's known whereabouts, forensic evidence that seemed to have been processed with unusual haste, witnesses whose initial statements differed significantly from their testimony at trial. The whole case feels engineered, she confided to her partner, Detective Marcus Washington, a veteran officer who had been on leave during the original investigation. Like someone constructed it backward, starting with Elias as the culprit and then building evidence to support that conclusion. Washington, initially skeptical, was won over by Chen's methodical approach and the mounting anomalies she uncovered. If Thorne didn't do it, who did? He asked during a late-night review of case files. Chen hesitated before voicing the suspicion that had been growing in her mind. What about his father? Washington laughed, but the sound died in his throat when he saw Chen's expression. Richard Thorne. The Richard Thorne. Chen, that man is practically Oak Creek royalty. Which would make him practically untouchable, Chen pointed out. The perfect cover. They began looking into Richard's background, a task made difficult by his prominence and the reluctance of officials to provide access to records involving such a respected figure. What they did uncover was troubling, gaps in Richard's history during his college years that coincided with a series of unsolved campus assaults, connections to regions where unsolved murders had occurred during his business trips, a pattern of relationships with women who later disappeared or died under questionable circumstances. Most significantly, they discovered that Detective Reeves, who had led the original investigation against Elias, had a brother whose law firm had been saved from bankruptcy by Richard's intervention just months before the murders began. This goes deeper than we thought, Washington said grimly. If Richard Thorne really is behind this, he's had half the town in his pocket for decades. Their investigation might have stalled there if not for Richard's growing carelessness. His most recent victim, the 26-year-old director of a women's shelter that Richard's foundation supposedly supported, was found with a unique fiber under her fingernails, a thread from a custom-made suit, traced back to an exclusive tailor who served a very select clientele, including Richard Thorne. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough for Chen and Washington to obtain a warrant to search Richard's home, focusing particularly on the basement room that Elias had mentioned in his initial claims. What they found there shattered any remaining doubts. Behind a false wall in Richard's meticulously organized file room was a smaller space, a shrine to death containing trophies from dozens of victims spanning more than 30 years. Photographs, jewelry, IDs, personal items, all carefully labeled with dates and locations. Among them were items from the 3 murders for which Elias had been convicted. Most damning of all was Richard's journal, a bound leather volume in which he had recorded his work, in clinical detail, methods used, emotional states of victims, reflections on his technique. The earliest entry dated back to Richard's 16th year, describing his first kill, a neighborhood cat whose death had given him a clarity previously unknown. As Chen read through the journal, a chill settled deep in her bones. Richard Thorne wasn't just a killer. He was a predator who viewed murder as an art form, who derived intellectual and emotional satisfaction from the suffering of others. And he had sacrificed his own son to protect his ability to continue this art. When they moved to arrest Richard at his office, they found him calmly waiting, as if he'd been expecting them. He offered no resistance, maintaining an eerie composure as they led him out in handcuffs past shocked colleagues and clients. "You've made a grave mistake," he told Chen with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm a respected member of this community. This will not end well for your career." Chen met his gaze without flinching. "Multiple murders, including framing your own son. I think I'll take my chances, Mr. Thorne." It was only when they mentioned the hidden room, described the contents of the journal, that Richard's composure finally cracked. A flash of rage contorted his features before settling into a cold, calculating stare. "I want my lawyer," he said, the last words he would speak directly to investigators. Within days, the case against Elias Thorne began to unravel. Evidence that had been suppressed during the original trial emerged. Witnesses recanted, admitting they had been pressured or incentivized to testify against Elias. The forensic inconsistencies that Chen had identified were confirmed by independent experts. 15 years after his wrongful conviction, Elias Thorne was exonerated and released from Oak Creek Penitentiary. The media descended like vultures, clamoring for the story of the innocent man imprisoned by his killer father. Elias, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and the dizzying reality of freedom, gave only one brief statement before disappearing from public view. Justice is not merely the absence of injustice, he told the assembled reporters, his voice hoarse from disuse. True justice would have prevented 15 years of my life from being stolen. True justice would have saved the lives of all those who died while I sat in a cell for crimes I didn't commit. He left Oak Creek that same day, driving away from the only home he'd ever known, away from the reporters and the painful memories, toward the small town of Havenwood where no one knew his name or his story. Behind him, Richard Thorne awaited trial, his carefully constructed world in ruins, his true nature finally exposed to the light. Chapter 6, Rebirth in Havenwood. The cabin in Havenwood became Elias's sanctuary and his project. The physical labor of renovation, replacing rotted boards, patching the leaking roof, clearing the overgrown yard, provided a much-needed outlet for the restless energy that accompanied his re-entry into society. Prison had instilled in him rigid routines that were difficult to break. He woke before dawn each day, made his bed with military precision, and rationed his meals with institutional regularity. Freedom was disorienting in its options, its lack of structure. The world had changed dramatically in 15 years. Smartphones, social media, streaming services, autonomous vehicles, technology had advanced at a pace that left Elias feeling like a time traveler from a simpler era. He struggled with self-checkout machines at the local store, was baffled by the proliferation of coffee options at the diner, and found himself overwhelmed by the constant connectivity that others took for granted. More challenging still was human connection. Years of isolation had left Elias wary, his social skills atrophied. Casual conversation felt like navigating a minefield. What was appropriate to share? How much of his past should he reveal? Would people recoil if they knew who he was, what he had endured? Initially, he kept to himself, venturing into town only for supplies, avoiding extended interaction. But Havenwood, it turned out, had its own way of drawing him out. It began with Eleanor Jenkins, the 70-something librarian who caught him lingering in the stacks one rainy afternoon. "You're new," she stated bluntly, eyeing him over horn-rimmed glasses. "The man who bought the old Miller place." Elias tensed, waiting for the inevitable questions about his past, his purpose in Havenwood. Instead, Eleanor simply handed him a library card application. "We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 6. The coffee's terrible but free, and we don't enforce the silence rule except during children's story hour on Thursdays." That library became a second home for Elias. He devoured books on subjects that had been inaccessible during his incarceration, catching up on historical events he'd missed, reacquainting himself with the pleasure of reading without the constant background noise of prison. Eleanor never pried, but she recommended books with uncanny insight, memoirs of resilience, novels about second chances, practical guides to skills he might need for his cabin renovation. Sometimes they discussed what he'd read, brief conversations that gradually extended in length and depth. Then came Raymond Cooper, owner of the hardware store, who offered advice on Elias's renovation projects and eventually proposed the trade. Raymond's expertise for Elias's help designing an addition to the store. "Heard you were an architect before," Raymond said casually one day. When Elias froze, Raymond added, "Small town. Word gets around. Don't much care about the rest of it. Man's past is his own business." Slowly, cautiously, Elias began to engage with the community. He volunteered at the library, shelving books and later helping Eleanor digitize the ancient card catalog. He attended town meetings, sitting quietly in the back but absorbing the rhythms and concerns of his new home. He designed a playground for the elementary school, his first architectural work in 15 years. Not everyone was welcoming. There were whispers, sideways glances, parents who pulled their children closer when he passed. His past had followed him, fragments of his story spreading through town gossip networks. But for every person who shunned him, there seemed to be another who offered a tentative chance of connection. At Eleanor's insistence, Elias began seeing Dr. Nadine Lewis, a therapist who operated a small practice in Havenwood 3 days a week. Initially resistant, he found unexpected relief in speaking openly about his experiences, the betrayal, the loss, the lingering trauma of imprisonment. "What haunts me most," he confessed during one session, "isn't the years I lost. It's that I grew up with him. I loved him. I still remember him teaching me to fish, helping with homework, coming to my college graduation. How do I reconcile that father with the monster he truly was?" "Perhaps both versions were real," Dr. Lewis suggested gently. "The capacity for compartmentalization in humans is extraordinary. Richard may have genuinely cared for you in his way, while still being capable of unspeakable acts." "That's almost worse," Elias said. "The idea that love and monstrosity could coexist in the same person." Dr. Lewis nodded. "The most frightening truth about evil is that it rarely announces itself. It lives alongside ordinary human emotions, ordinary human behaviors. That's what makes it so difficult to identify, and so devastating when it's finally revealed." These sessions became crucial to Elias's healing process, a safe space to examine the complex tangle of emotions surrounding his father. Anger, betrayal, grief, and, most troubling of all, fear that some shadow of Richard's darkness might lurk within him as well. Nature versus nurture, he told Dr. Lewis during a particularly difficult session. I keep thinking about it. Did I escape whatever genetic flaw made him what he was? Or is it dormant in me, waiting? Elias, Dr. Lewis said firmly, the fact that you worry about this question is itself an answer. Your father never questioned his actions or feared his capacity for harm. Your concern, your empathy, your moral compass, these are what define you, not your DNA. Gradually, painfully, Elias began to forge a new identity, not defined by his wrongful conviction or his father's crimes, but by the choices he made each day in Havenwood. He resumed his architectural work, starting small with local renovation projects and gradually building a modest practice that specialized in sustainable design. 2 years into his life in Havenwood, he received an unexpected visitor. Detective Sarah Chen, now Chief Chen following a departmental reorganization in Oak Creek, stood on his porch one overcast morning, looking somewhat uncomfortable in civilian clothes. I hope I'm not intruding, she said. I wanted to deliver this in person. This was a box containing Elias's original digital dossier, the observations and suspicions about his father that no one had believed 15 years earlier, along with copies of the evidence that had finally exonerated him. Richard's trial is scheduled for next month, Chen informed him. The prosecutor wanted me to ask if you'd be willing to testify. Elias invited her in, offered coffee, and listened as she outlined the case against his father. Richard had maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, had hired an expensive legal team, and was attempting to position himself as the victim of a conspiracy. We have enough to convict him without your testimony, Chen assured him. But having his son speak to the pattern of behavior, to the deliberate framing, it would be powerful. Elias was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the garden he'd painstakingly cultivated behind his cabin. I'll testify, he said finally. Not for revenge. For closure. For the victims and their families. The trial of Richard Thorne became a national sensation, covered extensively by media outlets fascinated by the story of the respected lawyer revealed to be a prolific serial killer. Elias's testimony drew particular attention, the wrongfully convicted son facing his monstrous father across the courtroom. Richard, impeccably dressed and composed as ever, watched Elias with cold calculation as he recounted the subtle patterns of behavior he'd observed over the years, the growing suspicions, the discovery of the hidden trophies. Not once did Richard show remorse or even recognition of the lives he'd destroyed, including his sons. When the guilty verdict was announced, 26 counts of first-degree murder, with additional charges of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and perjury, Richard's expression never changed. He was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. Reporters clamored for Elias's reaction, but he slipped away without comment, returning to Havenwood and the quiet life he was building there. The trial had been necessary, but it had also reopened wounds that were still healing. In the aftermath, Elias found himself at a crossroads. The renewed media attention had brought unexpected opportunities, offers for book deals, speaking engagements, consulting positions with innocence projects and criminal justice reform organizations. For weeks, he avoided making any decisions, uncertain which path to choose. The answer came unexpectedly during a community meeting about establishing a youth center in Havenwood. As the discussion turned to fundraising challenges, Elias found himself speaking up. I might be able to help with that, he said, surprising himself as much as the others present. My story. There's interest in it. Maybe I could use that interest to benefit something worthwhile. In the months that followed, Elias carefully re-entered public life, not as a victim seeking sympathy or a curiosity to be examined, but as an advocate for systemic change. He began with a single speaking engagement at a nearby university, sharing his experience of wrongful conviction and the flaws in the criminal justice system that had facilitated it. That one speech led to others. He collaborated with innocence projects, sharing insights from both sides of his unique experience, as the wrongfully convicted and as the son of a killer who had manipulated the system to his advantage. He wrote thoughtful op-eds about prison conditions, the psychological impact of incarceration, and the challenges of re-entry after exoneration. To his surprise, Elias discovered that he had a gift for public speaking. The architect's eye for structure translated well to crafting compelling narratives. The years of isolation had given him a perspective that resonated with audiences. The hard-won wisdom of his journey from victim to survivor lent weight to his words. Yet even as his public profile grew, Havenwood remained his anchor. He expanded his cabin, adding a studio where he could work on architectural designs. He deepened his connections within the community, no longer the mysterious newcomer but a neighbor, a friend, a valued member of the town. 5 years after his release, Elias established the Second Chance Foundation, dedicated to supporting exonerees transitioning back into society. The foundation provided housing assistance, vocational training, mental health services, and legal support to men and women attempting to rebuild lives shattered by wrongful conviction. Freedom is just the beginning, he often told the exonerees he worked with. Healing is a longer road, and no one should walk it alone. Chapter 7. Legacies. 10 years into his new life, Elias returned to Oak Creek for the first time since his release. The town had changed, new buildings, new faces, a subtle shift in atmosphere. Yet as he drove through familiar streets, past his childhood home, now owned by a young family, past his father's former law office, converted to a medical clinic, the weight of memory pressed heavily upon him. His destination was Oak Hill Cemetery, where his mother was buried. He had avoided this pilgrimage for years, uncertain whether he could face the physical reminder of her absence, of her tragic end. But time and therapy had given him tools to manage his grief, to carry it without being consumed by it. Margaret Thorne's grave was simple but elegant, a polished granite headstone with her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Mother." Richard, following his conviction, had been stripped of control over the family estate, and Elias had arranged for this marker to replace the ostentatious monument his father had commissioned. Elias placed white lilies, Margaret's favorite, against the stone and brushed away leaves that had gathered at its base. He stood in silence for a long moment, the autumn wind rustling through nearby trees. "I wish you had known the truth sooner, Mom," he said softly. "Maybe you could have found a different way to cope with it. Maybe we could have helped each other heal." He had long ago abandoned his anger toward his mother for believing in Richard's guilt, for not standing by her son. Understanding the manipulation she had endured, the shock of discovering her husband's true nature, had led to forgiveness. Now he felt only sorrow for the pain she must have experienced in those final months, alone with an unthinkable truth and unbearable guilt. As Elias turned to leave, he noticed a woman standing a respectful distance away, tall, with auburn hair streaked with grey, watching him with hesitant recognition. "Elias," she called. "Elias Thorne." It took him a moment to place her, Kate Pearson, daughter of Judge Samuel Pearson, one of his father's victims. They had attended the same high school, had moved in the same social circles before tragedy had shattered both their lives. "I thought it might be you," she said, approaching slowly. "I saw the Foundation's website recently, the work you're doing for exonerees. It's remarkable." Elias tensed, uncertain what to expect. The families of Richard's victims had had varied reactions to his exoneration, some relieved that justice had finally been served, others struggling to reconcile their image of Elias as the killer with his proven innocence. "I come here every month," Kate explained, gesturing toward a nearby grave. "Dad's buried just over there." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, laden with shared history and divergent experiences of the same tragedy. "I owe you an apology," Kate said finally. "I was vocal about your guilt during the trial. I said terrible things to the press, pushed for the harshest sentence. I needed someone to blame, and you were convenient." "You don't owe me anything," Elias replied. "You'd lost your father in the most traumatic way possible. You deserve justice." "Yes, but not at the expense of another innocent person." She met his gaze directly. "When the truth about your father came out, I was forced to confront my own role in your wrongful conviction. The certainty I'd felt, the righteous anger. It all collapsed." They walked together through the cemetery, sharing stories of the aftermath, Kate's struggle with guilt, her eventual decision to become an advocate for criminal justice reform, her current work with a restorative justice program in Oak Creek. "The irony is," she said as they reached the cemetery gates, "your father's crimes ended up creating something positive through both of us, two people devoted to fixing the system he exploited." The unexpected encounter with Kate led to others as Elias cautiously reconnected with his past. Detective, now Chief, Chen invited him to speak to Oak Creek's police cadets about the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations. Raymond's brother in Oak Creek offered him architectural work renovating a historic downtown building. Even Detective Reeves, now retired and in failing health, requested a meeting to offer a long overdue apology. These tentative reconnections did not erase the trauma of the past, but they provided a different kind of closure, an integration of his fractured history rather than an escape from it. As his foundation grew, Elias found himself increasingly drawn to cases involving familial betrayal, parents who had falsely accused children, siblings who had provided false testimony, families torn apart by miscarriages of justice. He understood the unique pain of these situations in a way few others could, having experienced the ultimate betrayal from the person who should have protected him most. One such case brought him to a small town in Idaho, where a young woman named Jessica Mercer had spent 8 years in prison for a robbery-homicide actually committed by her stepfather. Released 3 months earlier, Jessica was struggling with re-entry, haunted by her family's betrayal and the community's lingering suspicion. "I can't stay here," she told Elias during their first meeting at a local diner. "Every face I see, I wonder, did they believe in me? Did they celebrate when I was convicted? Are they disappointed I'm free?" Elias recognized the desperation in her eyes, the same disorientation he had felt upon his own release. "The hardest thing," he said gently, "is learning to live with other people's perceptions when you can't control them." "How did you do it?" Jessica asked. "Start over in a new place, build a life from nothing." Elias considered his answer carefully. "One connection at a time. One day at a time. Finding people who see you as you are now, not as what happened to you. Through the foundation, he arranged housing for Jessica in a neighboring state, enrolled her in a vocational program that matched her interests, and connected her with a support group of fellow exonerees. When she called 6 months later to report that she'd completed her certification and found steady employment, Elias felt a deep satisfaction that never diminished no matter how many similar calls he received. Each person helped was a small victory against the legacy of his father's cruelty, a life reclaimed, hope restored, the possibility of joy reintroduced to someone who had thought it forever beyond reach. On the 15th anniversary of his release, Elias published a memoir titled, Reconstructed, Building a Life After Wrongful Conviction. Unlike the sensationalized accounts others had written about the case, Elias's book focused primarily on his journey after exoneration, the psychological challenges of re-entry, the process of rebuilding identity, the difficult path toward forgiveness. The book became an unexpected bestseller, bringing renewed attention to the Foundation's work and to the broader issues of wrongful conviction and prison reform. Elias found himself speaking at universities, testifying before legislative committees, consulting on cases across the country. This public role remained uncomfortable at times. He had never sought fame or prominence. His preference was still for the quiet rhythms of Havenwood, for the simple pleasures of architectural work and garden cultivation. Yet he recognized that his unique experience gave weight to his advocacy, opened doors that might otherwise remain closed to the cause of justice reform. In Oak Creek Maximum Security Prison, Richard Thorne followed his son's rising prominence with cold interest. He maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, filing endless appeals and petitions that were systematically rejected. His fellow inmates kept the distance, wary of the calculating intelligence that radiated from him even in confinement. Prison staff noted that Richard requested every article about Elias, every interview, every mention of the Foundation. He never commented on them, never reached out to his son, but his attention never wavered, a predator's focus, patient and unrelenting. When Richard died in prison at the age of 82, a massive stroke that took him in his sleep, Elias received the news with a complex mix of emotions. There was no grief for the man his father had become, but there was a certain grief for the father he had once believed he had, the mentor, the advocate, the man who had taught him to ride a bicycle and helped him build his first model bridge. More prominent than grief was relief that Richard's shadow no longer fell across the living world, that his manipulation and cruelty were finally, irrevocably ended. The prison officials asked if Elias wanted his father's personal effects, the few possessions Richard had been permitted to keep in his cell. Elias declined. Whatever insights those items might offer into his father's mind, he had no desire to excavate them. Some mysteries were better left unexplored. Richard was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, attended only by a prison chaplain who offered perfunctory prayers for a man few would mourn. Elias did not attend the burial. Instead, on the day of Richard's funeral, he visited his mother's grave again, bringing fresh lilies and quiet words of remembrance. As decades passed, the Thorne case receded from public memory, becoming a footnote in criminology textbooks, an occasional reference in documentaries about wrongful conviction or serial killers. But the Foundation's work continued, expanding to include advocacy for prison education programs, mental health services for the incarcerated, and support systems for families of the wrongfully convicted. In his 70s, Elias stepped back from the Foundation's day-to-day operations, mentoring younger advocates to carry the work forward. He focused more on his architectural practice, designing sustainable homes and community spaces that reflected his belief in the possibility of renewal and transformation. Havenwood remained his home, the place where he had rebuilt himself from the ruins of betrayal and injustice. He had never married, the psychological scars of his ordeal had made intimate relationships challenging, but he was far from alone. His life was rich with meaningful connections, with the chosen family he had gathered over decades. When Eleanor Jenkins passed away at 93, she left Elias her collection of first editions and her cottage by the lake. When Raymond Cooper retired, his son continued the tradition of consulting Elias on building projects and inviting him for Friday night chess games. The children who had once been warned away from that ex-con now brought their own children to the playground he had designed, some studying architecture under his occasional guidance at the community college. On the 30th anniversary of his release, the governor issued a formal apology to Elias for the state's role in his wrongful conviction. A substantial compensation package accompanied the apology, far more than the meager sum he had received upon his initial exoneration. Elias donated the entire amount to the Foundation, establishing an endowment to ensure its work would continue beyond his lifetime. That same year, Dr. Nadine Lewis, now retired but still serving as Elias's occasional therapist and regular friend, asked him a question that gave him pause. After everything, she said during one of their conversations on his porch, "Do you think you've found peace?" Elias gazed out at the garden he had cultivated for 3 decades, at the town that had become his sanctuary and his purpose. "Not peace, exactly," he replied slowly. "More like integration. I've stopped trying to separate my life into before and after, into what was taken and what was rebuilt. It's all part of the same story now." Dr. Lewis nodded, understanding the significance of this perspective. "And Richard? Have you integrated him as well?" That's been the hardest part, Elias admitted. Reconciling the father I thought I knew with the monster he truly was. I still dream about him sometimes. Not nightmares, but ordinary moments from childhood, moments that felt genuine at the time. I wonder if any of it was real. Perhaps the question isn't whether his affection was real, Dr. Lewis suggested gently. Perhaps the question is whether your love for him was real. And it was. That capacity for love, even for someone who ultimately betrayed you so completely, that's part of what makes you who you are, Elias. It's what separated you from him from the very beginning. As Elias entered his 80s, he began work on what he considered his legacy project, a comprehensive redesign of the Foundation's Rehabilitation Center for Exonerees. The building would incorporate elements he had developed throughout his architectural career, spaces designed for healing, for community, for the gradual reclamation of agency and possibility. Architecture isn't just about structures, he told the young architects who collaborated with him on the project. It's about creating spaces that shape experience, that facilitate connection, that offer both shelter and possibility. For people whose lives have been defined by confinement, the right environment can be transformative. The center, located on a wooded property outside Havenwood, would include transitional housing, educational facilities, therapy spaces, and community areas designed to ease the difficult transition from incarceration to freedom. Every element reflected Elias's intimate understanding of that journey, the overwhelming sensory input of unrestricted space, the disorientation of unlimited choices, the terror and exhilaration of rebuilding identity after years of imposed anonymity. On the day construction began, Elias stood at the edge of the property, watching as the foundation was laid for what would be his most important architectural achievement. Beside him stood Jessica Mercer, now the Foundation's executive director, and a group of current exonerees who would be the first residents of the completed center. This place, Elias told them, is built on the belief that what was broken can be made whole again. Different, perhaps, than it would have been, scars don't disappear, but whole nonetheless. Functional. Strong. Even beautiful in its resilience. As he spoke these words, Elias realized they applied as much to his own life as to the center they were building. From the broken pieces of a life shattered by betrayal, he had constructed something meaningful, not despite his suffering but through it, using the very materials of his pain to create spaces of healing for others. Richard Thorne's legacy should have been destruction, lives ended prematurely, families devastated, communities fractured by fear and suspicion. His son's legacy, by deliberate choice and persistent effort, would be the opposite, a foundation, literal and figurative, upon which others could rebuild their shattered lives. Standing there as the autumn light filtered through the trees, Elias felt a sense of completion that had eluded him for most of his life. The cycle his father had initiated, the pattern of destruction that had claimed so many victims, had been interrupted. In its place was a new pattern, one of construction and reconstruction, of healing and hope. It was not peace, exactly. But it was enough. Epilogue. In the soft light of dawn, 85-year-old Elias sat on the porch of his cabin, watching as deer emerged cautiously from the woods that bordered his property. His hands, once strong enough to shape materials into structures, now showed the tremors of age. But his mind remained sharp, his eyes clear as they took in the world he had helped reshape. The Rehabilitation Center was thriving under Jessica's leadership, having served hundreds of exonerees in the 15 years since its construction. The Foundation had expanded its focus to include preventative work, training programs for law enforcement, advocacy for forensic science reform, legal clinics specializing in flawed convictions. Elias no longer practiced architecture formally, but he continued to sketch designs, to mentor young architects interested in spaces that fostered healing and community. His memoir had been republished multiple times, translated into 17 languages, and incorporated into criminal justice curricula across the country. Oak Creek had slowly transformed as well. The shadow of Richard Thorne's crimes had faded, replaced by a community-wide commitment to restorative justice championed in part by Kate Pearson, who now served as the town's mayor. The police department, under the leadership of Chief Chen's protégé, had become a model for evidence-based investigation practices and wrongful conviction prevention. Elias rarely thought of his father now. Richard's existence had narrowed to an occasional reference in conversation, a footnote in the larger story of what had emerged from the wreckage he left behind. The nightmares had ceased decades ago, the flashbacks dulled to occasional, manageable memories. What remained was a sense of purpose fulfilled, of a life lived not in reaction to trauma but in deliberate creation from its aftermath. Elias had not merely survived his father's betrayal. He had transformed it into something entirely different, a force for reconstruction rather than destruction. As the sun rose fully above the trees, casting long shadows across the garden he had tended for 4 decades, Elias closed his eyes and breathed deeply of the morning air. There was still work to be done. There would always be work to be done when it came to justice, to healing, to building spaces where broken lives could be reconstructed. But in this moment, watching the light transform his small corner of the world, Elias Thorne was at peace with his legacy, a legacy not of blood and betrayal, but of resilience and renewal, of a life rebuilt from ruins into something stronger than before. The end. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. And don't forget those post notifications for the next Hood Tales installment.